will begin. Okay, and we're live. So, as I said, heraldry requires lubrication. Get your beverage of choice, and we will proceed. Let me put up the screen share and. Okay. So this is Names 301, Introduction to Russian Names, and I am Yehuda ben Moshe, Elmet Herald, the East Kingdom Education Deputy. And we're going to cover the very basics of Russian names as used in the SCA. The main reference for this is the book by Paul Wickenden of Thanat, normally referred to as Wickenden, a dictionary of period Russian names. There's the second edition of it is available free online at the link on the screen. And the third edition can be purchased through the SCA stock clerk. The third edition contains more stuff than the second. So if you do a lot of Russian names work, it's worth having. On the other hand, the second edition is searchable, which is very nice. This is pretty much the work on Russian names in the SCA. There's just nothing else that has the breadth of Wickenden. It's not without its limitations. We'll discuss that later. There's also a few other articles, most of them written by the same person, by Paul Wickenden. And they're useful as well. So let's start with some definitions. Given name. Okay, this is what the main personal name of somebody. It's usually given to someone at birth or a naming ceremony, like a baptism. The modern first name, what we tend to think of today as first names, is a given name. Now, in some cultures, you can have multiple given names. For example, the modern middle name is frequently a second given name. By name. By name is any part of the name that's not the given name. It's basically everything else. There's different types of by names that occur in different cultures. There's lots of them. The modern last name is a type of by name. It's what's called an inherited surname. And if you go to SINA Appendix B, it describes all the different kinds of by names in detail. But we're going to hit a few of them just as by way of refresher. So locative. Locative, it just talks about where someone is from. We talk about marked versus unmarked locative. A marked locative has some sort of indicator that it's a locative. Of York, de Marseille, on Hamburg. Those particles of, de, von, they mark the locative. They say from. You can also have an unmarked locative. Jack London could well be someone who is from London, without that of. Patronymics. Patronymics are very common. They're formed from the person's father's name. Some of the earliest and most common types of by names. Again, you can have them marked. Nyal's daughter, Johnson, Petrovich. They all have something in them that indicates that it's a patronymic. You can also have them unmarked. John Henry could be John, son of Henry. You do see occasionally matronymics where the mother's name is used, although in most cultures they're much less common. You have descriptive by names. They're formed from a distinguishing characteristic, the tall, grosse, which is great in German. Gulskegger is Norse for gold beard. They all describe physical characteristics. And a special type of descriptive by name is what's called an occupational by name, which describes the occupation. A few examples: English draper, Spanish guerrero, meaning soldier, Italian sardello, which is a seller of sardines. We also get what's called cognamento by names, which are sometimes called alias or dictus. It's a second given name the person goes by. So you frequently see things something like Johannes Dictus John. His real name is Johannes, but everyone just calls him John. It's another type of by name.
So it'd be like Michael Dictus Mike.
Yeah, nickname. But you will see these in writings, in records,
Yeah.
Because a lot of times before you get real what we think of as last names, all right, well, it's Johannes. Well, which Johannes? It's the one called John. Because the other Johannes is called something else. And then you have inherited names. You get clan names. You see them in Gaelic, for example. And then you have the inherited surname. This is the modern last name, the thing that you inherit, through the paternal line or through another line. So, modern Russian names generally take the form of a given name, a patronymic, and an inherited surname. Имя, отчество, фамилия. Okay, that's the way modern speakers of the language are used to seeing Russian names. If you go talk to anyone from Russia, this is what they expect to hear. As an example, Ivan Vasilievich Romanov. His name is Ivan. His father's name was Vasily, and his last name is Romanov. Period Russian names were different. Early on, all you had was the given name. Until the 10th century, it's pretty rare to see anything else. Around the 10th century, and then throughout the end of the time period, and even through today, you started seeing the patronymic, the отчество. Very, very common, still in use today, one of the few places in the world where the patronymic is still used. And as I said, it appeared about the 10th century. Now, the inherited surname arrived late in period 15th, 16th century, but was still very, very rare. It really didn't enter common use until 18th century, well after the SCA's period. For most of our period, they're just not appropriate. You see a lot of people registering them because that's what they think of as Russian names, but they're really, unless you're very high nobility and very late in period, it's probably not appropriate. All right, let's talk about given names. Russia was Christianized in 988. And after that, most Russians used two given names, a Christian given name and what's called an Old Russian given name. Right? Christian names, which are also sometimes called canonical names or baptismal names, many of them are biblical in origin, and many of them are Byzantine in origin, Greek, because, of course, the Russian church came from the Greek Orthodox Church, and that's where these names came from. They came from Greek Orthodox saints and such. So, Ivan, which is a form of John, Konstantin, Pavel, the Russian form of Paul. These are all Christian given names. Then you have the Old Russian names, which are sometimes called Pagan names. They tend to come from pre-Christian native tribes, and a lot of them are also of Scandinavian origin, because, of course, there was a lot of Scandinavians, Vikings, and traders and such in Russia early in period. In fact, the word Russia, Rus, comes from the Old Norse. Oleg, Igor, Guba, these are all Old Russian names. I have something out of sequence there. Okay, most common is Christian plus a Christian name and an Old Russian one, or vice versa. Konstantin Oleg, Ivan Guba, Oleg Ivan. That's by far the most common thing we see in period documents, is a Christian name and an Old Russian name in either order. You do see single given names. They do occur. You do occasionally see double Old Russian names. Double Christian names happen. They're rare. In fact, Wickenden says they weren't done, but they were. We have records that show they were. He kind of makes an argument, well, there's no reason for them. That's true, but they were still done.
Right, you were baptized twice.
So they do occur, but it's unusual. Nicknames and diminutives were very often used as real given names in period. Today diminutives are thought of as informal names. In period, they were very much. This is Ivan. The diminutive is Ivanushka. Today, that no one would be named Ivanushka. It would be Ivan. But in period, you see records saying Ivanushka all the time. So
right, or like Mikhail would be Mishka.
Exactly. So very common. Female names are a problem. They're hard to come by. Women had little or no rights in medieval Russia, so their names just weren't recorded often. It's an issue. As I say, one of the best reference works on Russian names, a book called Tupikov. It's okay. This is Tupikov. It's an 800-page book. It has 16 pages of women's names.
Short story.
Okay, so it's it is what it is.
Yeah.
So Russian names are much more limited than masculine names, female names.
Can't we infer the same construction patterns, though, that they would have had a Christian name and an old name?
Yes, but what those names are, we have many fewer.
Right.
Right. The construction patterns were very similar. It's an issue of what are they? We mostly know the patterns. We don't know the elements.
Right.
We might have 1,000 masculine names and 100 feminine names.
Right, but it would seem to make sense that if they used, Byzantine saints for the males' names, they would also use the female Byzantine saints for the female names.
Not necessarily, because female saints weren't particularly venerated in Russia because they were female.
True. Okay.
Very misogynistic society.
Yeah.
Very. All right, patronymics. Formed from the given name of the father. And they follow specific grammar rules to transform from the normal given name form to a patronymic form. And if you've dealt with names from other cultures, especially things like Gaelic and Norse, people say, well, it's nominative case versus genitive case. It's not. This is not about cases. There is a nominative case and a genitive case, and it sometimes comes up, but the patronymic form is not the same thing as a genitive case. So don't confuse the two. There are specific rules, and I will go through them, at least the more common ones. They're complex and they have a lot of exceptions. So when you're dealing with a client who wants a Russian name, I would very much explain to them that this is hard. Russian names are complicated. There may need to be grammatical changes to the name. Don't let someone submit a Russian name and mark no changes. Chances are very good it'll be a return. I'm probably one of the 4 or 5 better Russian name people in the SCA, and I still make mistakes on this all the time. And I'm a native speaker. Okay, Russian names are frickin' complicated. Gaelic is the other one where I would never let a client submit and mark no changes, because sure enough, it'll get screwed up and need to be fixed. All right, so how do we form the patronymics? So if the given name ends in a hard consonant, we add OV. Hello.
Hello.
You're joining us midstream, but you'll be able to get the rest on the YouTube. It's being recorded. And we have Alana here, and this is, how do you pronounce your given name, your SA name? I can't hear you. You're muted.
How about now?
Perfect.
And Plisa.
And Plisa. Okay, I wasn't sure how to read that C with a cadilla.
Sure.
Okay, and Plisa. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so patronymics, forming a patronymic. If the given name ends in a hard consonant, you add OV. So the son of Anton is Antonov. The son of Mikhail is Mikhailov. If it ends in a soft consonant, you add an EV instead of an OV. Soft versus hard is kind of complicated to discuss. Soft consonants at the end of a word are rare. It's usually the Y letter. That's really about the only time you see them. But it's really beyond the scope of this class to explain the difference between hard and soft consonants. Soft consonants are also sometimes called palatized consonants. Okay, so but if you do have, basically, if you have in Russian it would be the Y letter. In English, if you see a Y at the end of the given name, then you generally add an EV rather than a OV.
What about Vasily?
Vasiliev, EV, Vasily, and it's an I. The example I use is my own Russian name, Yuli, which becomes Yuli. Then I dropped a Y in there. The Y doesn't disappear. Okay. If the given name ends in the letter A, you replace it with an IN. Drop the A, replace it with an IN. So the son of Borada becomes Boradi. The son of Guba becomes Gubin. If it ends in Ya, which in Russian is a single letter, but in English is represented by an IA, you replace that ending with a YN, which is a YN. And I don't have an example of that. All right. If you
Petya?
have... Huh?
Petya?
Petya, Petyev. No, because Petya... Yeah, Petyev. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, I've skipped somewhere. Petyin. It could be Petyin. It could be Petyin. Petya is weird because that's a diminutive, and we're starting in a weird spot.
Yeah.
And again, I'm giving the, as I mentioned earlier, and Lisa, there's lots of exceptions. These rules are complicated. I'm hitting the high points, kind of the most common cases. There are a million exceptions. So if the given name ends in II or IY, which is EE or EY in Russian, you replace it with that's apostrophe EV. The apostrophe is the Russian soft sign character. So son of Vasily becomes Vasiliev. Very occasionally you keep the first of those vowels. So you can also have Vasiliev. Instead of the soft sign, you keep that first I. But this is an unusual thing. You see it occasionally. Vasiliev would be much more common. All right. If the given name ends in a different vowel, any vowel other than the ones we just mentioned, replace the vowel with EV, with Yev. Son of Alexei becomes Alexeyev. If the given name already ends in OV or EV, which is what we usually tack on, then we add Lov or Lev, respectively, to the end of that. So Yev becomes Yevlev. Yaakov becomes Yaakovlev. Okay? So what I just described in, a dozen slides or so is what I call the simple patronymic form. Okay, Wickenden calls it the case one, the first form. This is by far the most common by name construction in period Russian. I can't name a number, but I wouldn't be surprised if 80 to 90% of all the names followed those rules. However, we do have the other 10 or 20% that do something more complicated. First of all, the word sin can be added. Okay, it means son. And that can be added after the patronymic. Vasily Ivanov sin can come before the patronymic. Vasily sin Ivanov. And if the father had two given names, just one or both can be used to form the patronymic. So if you have Vasily, the son of Ivan Guba, you can call him Vasily Ivanov. You can call him Vasily Gubin. You can call him Vasily Ivanov Gubin. And you can call him Vasily Gubin Ivanov, and then you can stick sin in there pretty much anywhere you'd like. There are lots of options. If the sin is used, it can be used before the first patronymic, between the patronymics. It can be used after the second, but that's rare. So you could have Vasily Ivanov sin Gubin, Vasily sin Ivanov Gubin, Vasily Ivanov Gubin sin. That's a rare construction. Don't try, if you know a little bit of modern Russian, don't try to make sense of this. Because when I started looking at period Russian names, I'm like, well, no, that means something different because that sin is in a different spot. No, it doesn't. Okay.
Now, as far as checking against conflict, if I have a client who wants Vasily Ivanov sin Gubin, and there's a Vasily sin Ivanov Gubin, do they conflict with each other?
I am not an expert on name conflicts. In fact, I'm not sure there is such a thing as an expert on name conflicts, including Pelican. However, my understanding is that no, they do not, because we don't conflict check for meaning. We only conflict check for sound and appearance, and
right. Moving
the elements around changes it enough that I think it would be clean. That's a question for somebody who's a better name herald than I am. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but the first time I ran into Vasily Ivanov sin Gubin, I said, "Oh, his name is Vasily Gubin, and he happens to be the son of Ivan." No, this is Vasily, the son of Ivanov Gubin. Why? Because that's the way they did it. Hello. All right. So, if the person had a famous grandfather, you can use the grandfather's name in the patronymic form with a word of nuk, which means grandson, added. Used the same way as sin. And in extreme cases, you can use pravnuk, and you can even use prapravnuk, great-great-grandson. Okay, the patronymic, if you have two, it's always the last one, can also be placed in the genitive case, which shows a greater degree of possession. We're not going to get into this one. I'll show some examples. Instead of Vasily Ivanovson Gubin, it's Vasily Ivanovson Gubina. You take the modified patronymic, you place it into the genitive case, or you take the unmarked father's given name and put it into genitive case. Not going to get into genitive case too much because really Russian cases are bloody complicated. They make Latin look easy. I just know that most of the time it's an issue of sticking an I at the end, but not always. All right. In some cases, patronymics use the ich ending, ICH. This was most popular in Novgorod and Pskov among the upper classes, but by the 16th and 17th century, this ending was restricted to the highest nobility, the boyars and the high court officials, and in fact it required the Tsar's permission to use. It was considered a great honor to be allowed to use an ich ending. Unless your client has a persona that is meant to be high nobility, I would avoid this, but people do like it. It's certainly used quite a bit modernly where it's no longer restricted. And generally, you just take the basic patronymic form and stick the ich on the end, and that's all there is to it. It would only be used with a single name of a two-name patronymic, most often the Christian one, but that may mix and match when using multi-generational patronymics. Ich is never combined with a genitive formation. So, Vasily, our friend Vasily, son of Ivan Gubin, could be Vasily Ivanovich. Okay, instead of Ivanov, we make it Ivanovich. He could be Vasily Ivanich, because you can take the unmodified, the unmarked Ivan and stick it on the end. He could be Vasily Gubinich, where you took the other one. But if you use both, it would be Vasily Gubin Ivanovich. You would always use this with the Christian name, with the ich in.
Unless they don't have a Christian name, in which case...
Unless they don't have one, or they don't use one, yeah.
Right, right.
There's one additional formation that you only see earlier. It pretty much disappears after the 13th century. And that's to take the names that end in av, put into patronymic form by adding an L soft sign. There's an apostrophe there. L apostrophe at the end. So Yaroslav would become Yaroslavich. We don't really do that anymore. That disappeared. It was replaced by a more general Yaroslavov, if you remember from before, but you do see this earlier in period. So, here's an actual person from 1176. Prince Vladimir Sviatoslavich, vnuk Vsevolod, pravnuk Olga, pravnuk Sviatoslavl, prapravnuk Yaroslav. Okay, say that 6 times fast. So let's break it down. What's his given name?
Vladimir.
Yeah. What's his father's name?
Sviatoslav.
Sviatoslav, using that ich nobility ending, right? What's his grandfather's name?
Vsevolod.
Vsevolod. Vsevolod. And he has 2 grandfathers. What are their names?
Olga and...
Olga is the patronymic. This is a weird one. It's actually Oleg. Why they dropped the ye in this particular one, I don't know. Could have been a scribal error. We don't know. It should be Olegov, but it's recorded as Olga.
So Olgov and...
So one of his grandfathers is Oleg. Right? Not Olga. Olga is patronymic form. So if you're talking to grandpa, it's Oleg. And his other grandfather is Sviatoslav, using that weird early period formation that we just talked about. And then his great-great-grandfather is Yaroslav, again using that weird early period formation. But notice that the formations are consistent within a given generation, but they change between generations, right?
Right.
His father he's using the ich formation, which is very unusual this early. But he was a high prince, one of the Veliki Knyaz, the highest nobility. His grandfather, we're using an unmarked patronymic, just Vsevolod. His two great-grandfathers, we've got two different formations. Olegov is the basic patronymic, and then the other one uses that early period weird one, and then the great-great-grandfather is, well, again, the early period ones. Perfectly okay to do it this way. You just don't mix within a name. So if you're using a double-named patronymic, then it has to be internally consistent, following the rules we discussed. But
and could that also be... Sorry, go ahead.
Between generations, perfectly fine to use different formations.
I was just having a question about his two grandfathers. Could it also be that one actually was significantly older than the other because one's a maternal and one's a paternal?
Don't know. Don't know much about this guy. I doubt that that's what it is. I think that's just the way it was used. You know, even to this day, there's some variation in how you form patronymics, and a lot of it is just how your father, you know, when your father named you, how they started using it. That's just kind of sticks.
Yeah.
So, you know, so if whichever of his grandfathers was the son of Oleg, you know, if he always went as Olga, they may have just kept that. If the other grandfather went as Sviatoslavl, that may have stuck down through the generations.
Gotcha.
Now, seeing a long family history like this is very rare. We mostly see it in, you know, royalty, where it's important to show familial descent, or where the predecessors are very important. You know, if your father was a nobody but your grandfather was an important person, okay, you might use the grandfather's name in addition to or instead. Oh, here's the
cheat sheet.
Okay. Feminine patronymics. And as I mentioned, due to the low social status and lack of legal rights of women in Russia, we don't have many feminine names. They just weren't recorded much because women didn't own property, they didn't enter into contracts. It was an extremely misogynistic society, you know, leading to you know, one of the famous jokes is, I thought I saw two people walking down the street, but it was just a man and his wife. You know, which has exactly the same misogynistic meaning in Russian as it does in English. Or the famous, a chicken is not a bird and a woman is not a person. So, as a result, we have very few records. Most of the records we have of Russian names are of nobility or royalty because they were important enough to be recorded. So it's an issue. As I said earlier, I think before, Lisa, you were here, one of my best reference books is 800 pages of Russian names, of which 16 are female names. Okay, and that's just fairly typical. So, what do we do? Well, most feminine patronymics are formed exactly like the masculine patronymics, and then you put them into the feminine gender, which is generally done by just adding the I at the end. Don't confuse this with the genitive before, which also usually puts an I at the end. So, if the masculine patronymic son of Alexei is Alexeyev, then the daughter of Alexei is Alexeyeva. Put it into the form and then add the I. Antonov becomes Antonova. Mikhailovich, there's our ich ending, becomes Mikhailovicha, although that's a pretty unusual formation. So, most commonly, especially in late period, is the familial form, which is basically just the patronymic plus Doch, which Doch means is daughter. Makrina Dmitrieva Doch. By the way, just anytime I list an example with a date, that means it's an actual period example. If there's no date, then it's just something I made up or Wickenden made up to illustrate the point. Upon being married, the same construction can be used with the husband's name and Zhena instead of Doch. So usually it's the husband's patronymic would also be used. But you put all the elements into the feminine gender, so Katerinka Stepanova Zhena Pranyakina is Katerinka, the wife of Stepan Pranyakin. This is one of those places where, so Stepan is the husband, and Pranyak is the husband's father. right? So the husband's full name is Stephan Pranyakin, and she is his wife. This is one of those places where knowing modern Russian screws you up, because when I first saw this, I said, oh, Katerinka must be the daughter of Stepan and the wife of Pranyakin. No. Wrong. Okay? Zhena can, much like sin and Doch, can come in different places, but this, where the Zhena is in the middle of the two, is probably the most common that I've seen. Drives me crazy. I don't know why they did it. It's dumb, but it's the way it worked. I mean, it's dumb from a modern Russian speaker's point of view. Obviously made sense then. Other relationship markers can include mat, mother of, vdova, widow of, and devka, which can mean either mistress or servant of, which, you know, the two are not mutually exclusive. And again, they'd be used the same way. You can combine the father's and husband's name using the conjunction a, which kind of means and but at the same time. So you would see something like Varvara Andreeva Doch, a Stepanova Zhena Ivanova, which means her name is Varvara, she's the daughter of Avdei, and she's the wife of Stepan Ivanov. Ivan is the father of Stepan. Okay, we see this fairly often, especially later in period. And one of the things, it's not in the PowerPoint because we're not allowed to use it, one of the things you see all the time in period documents is this kind of formation without the given name, because her name really wasn't important. What was important is whose daughter or whose wife she was. So you frequently see something like, you know, people just reference as wife of X or daughter of Y without a given name. We don't register that because our registration rules require a given name and a by name. So, okay. Modern feminine patronymics generally end in ovna or yevna. Okay, that's what is the most common in modern Russian. It's actually very rare in period. The only few citations I know of are from the Gray period, from between 1600 and 1650. Marfa Ivanovna, whereas normally we would expect Ivanova. Princess Yevdokia Lukianovna. Again, you would expect the normal formation would be Lukianova. Okay, we will allow it, we will register it, but it's really a almost post-period construction. I have yet to see an example before 1600. Okay, doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's very rare. It was a late, but this is what looks normal to modern Russian speakers, because modernly almost every feminine patronymic is formed that way. You would not see Marfa Ivanova. You would see Ivanovna, much, much more commonly today. And much like the ich ending from before, it's used primarily with a Christian name, not with the Old Russian name. All right, metronymics, named after the mother. It's very rare. It may sometimes suggest bastardry, because they didn't know who the father was. So you got a metronymic instead of a patronymic. It may also occur when the mother is much more important than the father, usually royalty, high nobility, that sort of thing. The rules are basically the same as for patronymics, but there's so few of these examples that it's hard to get any kind of pattern out of it. We haven't seen enough to draw meaningful patterns. They did exist. There are a few examples. All right, descriptive by names. They're very common, or fairly common, especially among women, for whatever reason. It was fairly common with women. And there's two grammatical forms, a patronymic form and an adjectival form. So the patronymic form is you take an adjective or a noun or a combination of the two, and you give it an ending just like you would a patronymic. You got to observe all the other rules of grammar, like gender agreement. And usually you would use that simple first form of the patronymic ending. You wouldn't use ich or ovna with this. So, bez barodov. Boroda is beard, bez is without, means clean shaven. So we have a combination of an adjective and a noun to form a patronymic type descriptive by name. Dolgonosov. Nos is nose, dolgi is long-nosed. Here's my personal favorite one, Nie Patsalueva. Patsalui is kissed, and Nie means not. It's the unkissed, and it's in a feminine form. Real period descriptive by name.
Poor
I don't know
thing.
what the story was, but, there it is. The adjectival form usually uses just a single common adjective. You put it in the right gender and use it. So, korotki or korotkaya means short. Дорогой, дорогая, dear. There's also what's called the possessive form, and it's used to indicate ownership, usually of a woman by her husband. It's kind of involved if you really want to see it look in Wickenden, because it's just, there's a lot of little finicky things with it, and it's not that common a thing. Toponyms. These are locative by names formed from the place name. Oh, well, we'll get it. So, and the three ways, unfortunately, are fairly complicated, which means usually if you want to, someone says, well, I want to be from Pskov. Fine. Rather than saying, okay, let's look up Pskov and form it into the correct form for a toponym, it's much better generally. See if you can just find it already formed, because we actually have a fair number of these, and Wickenden has a whole article on these. See if we can just, because the grammar here is involved. But there's basically three ways to do it. You can put it in patronymic form. Pskovich is a documented by name, meaning for someone from the city of Pskov, and it means literally son of Pskov. That's why it's a patronymic. It's as if Pskov was the father. You can use the noun form, Pskovitianin, which is very weird sounding to me, but apparently it's been used. The closest English would be Pskovite. Right, and then there's also the adjectival form, Pskovsky, as in the Pskovian. I'm not sure if those makes a lot of sense, but all three of those are ways to form a toponym from the name Pskov, from the city name Pskov. Now, in SCA use, you see some fairly often names formed by using is, meaning from or of, followed by the name, the place name in genitive, so something like is Pskova, meaning from Pskov. As far as I can tell, as far as Wickenden can tell, this is a pure Scadianism. It's not period usage. Never seen an example of this. We probably will continue to register it, but it's certainly something to steer clients away from if they're interested in authenticity. All right, a few notes of caution. Many by-names look like patronymics. Descriptives, occupational, locatives, we talked about the fact that they're in patronymic form. You form them like a patronymic. But what that means is you have to be careful trying to go back to a given name.
Right.
So, for example, the by-name Myasnikov means butcher. Myaso is meat. It's an occupational by-name. You can't turn around and say, oh, his father's name must have been Mysnik. No, there's no such name as Mysnik. Okay, Mysnik also means butcher. It's just not a Mysnik means butcher. As a by-name, you put it into patronymic form to get Mysnikov. But a lot of people will look at it and say, oh, that's patronymic, let me back out into a given name. Be very careful with it. Unless you're absolutely sure that it really is a given name, don't do it this way.
Now, is this where someplace like a modern Russian dictionary or list of verbs would come in handy to say?
Sure, it could. It could.
To double check that Myasnik is not something else real.
Well, so what I usually do, first of all, there is out there, and if someone is interested, shoot me an email and I will send it to you. I have in PDF form a historical Russian dictionary, which helps. Something like the OED, but for Russian. It's not nearly as good, but it is there.
I'll take that.
But you can also look for the name. The truth is, very few Russian names, as far as I can tell, disappeared. Most of them exist post-period. So if you're looking at, let's say we've got this Mysnikov, and you have a client that says, well, I really like Mysnik as a given name. Was it ever? And you look in Wickenden, you look here, you look there, you just can't find it in period. But you find it in the 18th century, in the 19th century. That's not documentation, but that's a pretty good that makes me think, okay, it's reasonable to back out the name, and it probably is a name of some sort. Will Pelican accept that? I don't know, but I also do it a different way. There's a number of names in Wickenden where he says, the name is blah, and his documentation for it is that there was somebody named Blaov. I generally try not to use those. We will accept them, because if it's in Wickenden, we will accept it. The ruling by Pelican is Russian is hard. We don't have many accessible sources. We're not going to second-guess Wickenden until someone writes a better book.
God bless Wickenden.
And I will totally do it right after I win the power, which is, when I'll have time to do this. So, if Wickenden has it, yes, it's registerable. I generally suggest avoiding those names that in Wickenden are documented only as a patronymic work backwards, because at least if it doesn't look like a name, if I look at it and say, oh, that's a normal name, then fine. But I try to steer clients away from it. Again, if it's in Wickenden, we'll register it. And I may be wrong. He may be absolutely correct, and he may have other evidence to suggest it's a given name. It's just not in there.
Right.
So, especially if someone's requesting authenticity, someone's looking for a really authentic name, is really into getting the persona right, that's the sort of thing to steer them away from. Occasionally we'll get someone who will say, I flipped through Wickenden, I found this name, this is the name I want, we're done. Okay, we're done. All right. Final thoughts that I always do, and it's a little bit expanded here, and that's registrable versus authentic, which is what we just talked about. A submission has to be registrable. It does not have to be authentic. We can encourage clients to come up with authentic names and devices. We can't and we shouldn't force them into it. If a client is set on a registrable but not authentic submission, process it. Send it out. They need to be happy. Wickenden, as I said, it's a fantastic resource, but it has its limitations. If you want a really authentic name, you got to use it more carefully. Look at the actual cited forms, not just the header forms. Better yet, go to other sources, including Wickenden's sites, the things that Wickenden cites. Two of his very common sources are books by Tupikov, which is that book I held up, I think, before you got here, Lisa, and Maroshkin. They're both available in ebook. They give you more detail. They go beyond. So if again, this is for authentic. If someone just wants something of Wickenden, by all means, give it to them. But if they're really looking for authentic, you may want to dig a bit deeper. Okay, and that's it. So this is me again. I'm Elmet Herald. And the link there at the bottom is the only link you should write down, because at that site you will be able to find a link to this video. You will find, once it's posted, you will find a link to this PowerPoint, the slides, as well as to all of my other videos and a few other things I've put together. That's it. Questions? Now we're open for general questions.
I've got one for you.
Sure.
Every part of the name goes back to the name source, the feminine form. Is that correct?
Say that again?
All of the feminine names go back to the feminine form instead of the masculine form?
Yes, it has to be in a feminine gender.
For every single bit of the name?
Every single bit, yeah.
Wow, okay,
Yes.
Interesting.
And usually that's done by putting an A at the end. And that's just gender agreement. That's just a matter of gender agreement. Basically, in grammar speak, and I'm bad at grammar, so I may not be getting this right, but the way I tend to think of it is all of these are basically adjectives. The given name is your subject. Everything else is basically an adjective. The adjectives have to agree in gender to the subject. That's one way to look at it.
That makes sense. That's like Spanish as well, then.
Yeah. If you think about it too, saying Adina, she is the daughter of. So you're basically the she is.
Right.
Is that you're adding at the end.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Russian is very strongly gendered language. There's masculine, feminine, and neuter, and you do need gender agreement like Spanish, like like German, like Latin, like most languages that are not English. English has about the simplest grammar of any language I encounter. It has the hardest phonetics, but it's the easiest grammar.
That's because we beat up other languages and steal their words.
That's right. Yes. We don't have cases. We don't have really. We have like 2 cases, but we pretend we don't. We don't have. We have genders, but we don't pay attention to them. We don't have. We don't have a lot of other things. Our conjugations are much simpler than in most other languages. We have lots of irregular words, but that's because I'm still looking for any regular verbs. I'm not convinced that there are any in English. So that's it. That's pretty much everything I've discussed is in the grammar section of Wickenden. I've reordered it a little bit in ways that I think make a little bit more sense to me. But the reference work is Wickenden. That's really the grammar section there is invaluable. And if you are working on a Russian name submission, absolutely look at it. Don't rely on just my PowerPoint. My PowerPoint is kind of the explanation, but that's the real source. And then for the elements, again, there's Wickenden, and then there's much harder to use sources, all of which pretty much are in Russian. So
yeah, that's where I was encountering issues, because I was trying to find some stuff just for my own personal edification. And my modern Russian is, many years old, and not good to start. As a matter of fact, as we were just talking, I found one of my exams, apparently, that I got a 70 on.
And one of the problems is most of the books on Russian names, even if you get your hands on them, they tend not to be real modern. They tend to be old, like pre-Russian Revolution, which means you've got extra characters to deal with because it's before the orthographic reforms of the late 19-teens, and you also get a lot of weird conventions. It's frequently hard to figure out. They may not give you a date. They do the same thing some English records do. They don't give you a date. They give you who was king. So now you have to go and figure out who the heck this guy was. Or they may cite to some other document and just assume you know what the date on that document is. And I don't. Most people don't. It says, well, this came out of such and such letterpiece. Great. When was that letterpiece written? And that letterpiece hasn't been in print in 80 years. So good luck.
Now,
or
I forget, Yehuda, does Wickenden show us the earliest documented form or the latest?
Earliest. And that's actually an excellent question because, as you guys probably know, the normal rule is name elements have to be within 500 years of each other. Mm-hmm. We don't pay attention to that in Russian. Because Wickenden doesn't give us every date, it only gives us the earliest. So Ivan, which has been used, we can probably document to every year of our time domain, but he will say Ivan, 630, well, no, probably not. Right after the Christianization, 992. And that's it. So if the other element you want comes from 1573, well, technically that's more than 500 years apart. In practice, of course, Ivan was still in use in 1573. It's still in use today. So because of that limitation of Wickenden, we don't enforce the time rules particularly hard.
Okay. That was my other question. How do you tell, timeline?
We can't. And it's an issue of, as I said, Wickenden has specific problems, specific issues, but there's just no other source that we have that's readily accessible to the SCA College of Heralds, College of Arms. So it's the best we have. When there's a couple of us, myself, Frida Gaudio Herald, Sophia. There's another lady who started posting recently, I don't remember her name, who can have the resources and language skills to dig a little bit deeper, but we generally only do that on authenticity requests. When someone requests an authentic name. You're muted, so I don't know if you're talking to us or not.
No, I've got a girl here.
Okay. Hello, girl there.
Want to say hi?
Hi.
Look
at the book of dinosaurs my grandma gave me.
Yeah.
Nice. My son likes dinosaurs a lot too.
I want you to see one.
No, honey.
There's one you never.
All right. So it's yeah. So that's there's been a ruling recently, like this year, where we looked at, there was a submission based on Wickenden where we looked at it and said, you know what, this is just wrong, and we can prove it's wrong. And it's wrong because it's not using, one of the requirements we have is that things have to use consistent transliteration, right? You can't change transliteration systems in the middle of a name. And we know that this name, the given name, both the given name and the by name came right out of Wickenden, and we were able to find that they used two different transliteration systems, because one name was directly transliterated, the other one actually was transliterated from the German because it came out of a German document. It was first mangled into German and then into English. And we looked at it quite a bit. We had a lot of discussion on it. And at the end of the day, Pelican said, you know what? We can't make the Herald, the consulting Herald, do this much work. We can't put this kind of burden on someone who doesn't speak Russian, doesn't read Russian, doesn't have access to anything but Wickenden. Until we get a better resource, we're just going to accept Wickenden as good. Now, on an authenticity request, that may be different. If someone says, here's the name, but please make it authentic, they check that authenticity request box, then we will dig, and then if we can find something better, we will give them something better. But,
which is why you encourage them not to do that.
Well, no. Authenticity requests, I don't discourage. I just want people to be, I just try to be really explicit. I tell people, they will change your name. They really will. And, and most people, when you explain it to them in great enough detail, you say, okay, well, what's more important to you? That the names sound the way you want it to sound, or that it be really authentic? They'll say, you know what? I don't want the authenticity request.
You were swaying a lot in your chair, and I was getting motions like
I'm on a swivel chair. I'm getting. I don't do holding still particularly well. So that's that's the nature of the authenticity requests. Some people do want them, but most of the time they don't. I put it.
And then, of course, you get the additional wrinkle of people going, oh, but I don't want you to change my name. And it's like, excuse me?
Right. Well, as Juliana, who's former Pelican, says, what they really want is for Pelican to wave their magic wand over it and declare it authentic.
Yes.
And
once she does that,
it's their form, but they're but they've been made comfortable with it being authentic. And no, we wave magic wands to make it registerable. We don't wave magic wands to make it authentic. So that's about it. Look at Wickenden, read the grammar section. If you're interested in going beyond that, shoot me an email. I have a bunch of other resources in PDF form and such that I'd be happy to share. Just realize they're all in Russian and mostly not modern Russian. I have that historical dictionary, which is great, except for the fact that some of the words are defined, and some of the words he gives German equivalents for, and some of the words he gives Latin equivalents for, and some of the words he gives Greek equivalents for.
Thank God I have dictionaries for all of those languages.
And the truth is, most of the time I've been able to figure it out just by common roots. But the problem is that the best historical dictionary I know for Russian isn't a complete work. It was some guy, some scholar, who started working on it and I guess passed away. And they basically took all his notes and published it. And it's even labeled. It's not labeled a dictionary. It's labeled, notes towards a dictionary.
Wow.
Which means they're in this rough, unfinished form sometimes. And so it's not that he intended to leave it in Latin. It's that what made sense in his head was, oh, that's the equivalent of this Latin word or that Greek word, so that's what he jotted down in his notes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. Hold on.